Kia ora koutou, and welcome to our digital event. It's really great to have you join us tonight. I'm Sarah Schoenberger, the Head of Research at the Neurological Foundation, and I have a saying on the wall in my office that I'd just like to read out to you tonight because I think it sums up really nicely what we do at the Foundation. I hara taku toa, I te toa takitahi, engari he toa takitini. It gives me great pleasure tonight to introduce our speaker, Dr. Helen Murray. Welcome, Helen.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So Helen is currently a Senior Research Fellow at the Centre for Brain Research at the University of Auckland. And at the moment, she is funded by a Neurological Foundation Senior Research Fellowship, which funds her personally. And then she's got a lot of other funding on top of that for her research. Helen has been a New Zealand representative in ice hockey since 2013 and has captained the New Zealand Ice Ferns from 2016 to 2020, and she's busy at the moment as it's hockey season. So we're really grateful that you've taken the time out from your busy research and hockey schedule to join us tonight and just let everyone know about the exciting research that's been happening.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Sarah. I'll just get this screen shared. All right. Oh, I think that just stopped. Sorry. Always the technology, isn't it? Um, all right. How's that? Can you see everything? Hopefully it's all working. I'm sure someone will tell me if it's not.
It's just come up now. It's looking good.
Perfect. Perfect. Kia ora koutou, thanks for coming, everyone. It's always a bit strange on Zoom when you can't see the audience, but I know you're all there, and I really appreciate that you've taken the time out of your evening to come and listen to this discussion about a topic that's really close and personal to my heart. As you heard from my introduction, I'm a hockey player. I'll talk a bit about that in a second. I'm a research fellow at the University of Auckland Centre for Brain Research, and I lead the Brain Injury and Neurodegeneration Research Group. And so what I'm going to show you today is, I guess, sort of what's become a very hot topic in New Zealand around, the links between head impact that we could experience throughout our lives in lots of different settings, but predominantly from a sporting context in the media right now, and what that can mean for our long-term brain health. So I guess I'll just start with a bit of an introduction as to who I am. So yes, as you heard, I'm a hockey player. So I play a contact sport myself. And I think if anyone has seen anything about ice hockey, you'll know that it is one of those sports where there's collisions and head impacts can happen. And so this has really been a motivation for my research, I guess sort of bringing together my experience studying degenerative brain diseases throughout my PhD and postdoctoral research career, and then also my lived experience kind of as an athlete and experiencing what happens in a concussion. So in the lab, you'll hear a lot about what I do tonight, but we study human brain tissue that is only really possible because of the Neurological Foundation Human Brain Bank, which is based at the Centre for Brain Research. So my experience is in the neuropathology, so the changes that happen in the tissue of the brain in the degenerative brain disease, and then really applying that knowledge to try and understand this link between brain injuries and how that can change our brain structure to potentially increase our risk for those diseases. I've had a great career so far. I'm really, fortunate to have studied at the University of Auckland for my PhD, and then I went over to the National Institutes of Health in Washington, DC, just before the pandemic and studied over there for a couple of years before coming back to New Zealand because, as someone who represents New Zealand, it's something that I always wanted to do this research at home. And with, because of the Neurological Foundation, really, I've been able to start my own research lab. So this is a slightly older photo from a couple of years ago, but I lead a lab with Dr. Bridget Ryan, I'll just bring up my cursor one second. Dr. Bridget Ryan here at the back, who is my sort of co-CEO of the lab group. We had 3 students each when this photo was taken at our lab Christmas party, strawberry picking a few years ago. But the group's now grown to about 7 people working on brain injury and degeneration. So, because of the support that we've had through funding agencies like Neurological Foundation, we've been able to grow a completely new area of research in New Zealand and just working with some really talented young students to make this all possible. So Let's get into the science. I'll give you a quick overview of what we're going to talk about tonight. So, I'm going to start by just defining some key concepts because I think there's a lot of terminology in this field of brain injury and concussion and degeneration, which can be a bit confusing. So, we'll try and define some of those first, and then talk about what actually happens in the brain with a head impact, what we actually see in the brain, the changes that we see. And then I'll talk a bit about a bit about our brain bank research and how we're trying to understand this more in the lab, and then get a sense of, what's actually changing in the brain with degeneration, and how can we use that to improve outcomes for people who experience these sorts of repeated head impacts over their lifetime. So I guess just to sort of start, I just want to point out I'm a research scientist, I'm not a clinician. And so I know lots of people have questions around treatments for brain injuries. I'm really going to talk about what we know from a scientific perspective and how we're trying to generate new findings and knowledge to help the clinicians give better diagnoses and treatments. So just to kind of set the scene there. So let's just talk about some terminology first. So the terms that you might hear a lot are really related to clinical syndrome. So something like a concussion is actually describing the symptoms that you can experience after a head injury. So that's sort of these changes in brain function after an injury. Dementia is also a clinical syndrome that can be caused by different diseases. And you might have heard this other one here, traumatic encephalopathy syndrome, in the context of CTE, which is a big topic we'll talk about a bit more today as well. But that's quite distinctive from a medical event. So, for example, a traumatic brain injury or a mild traumatic brain injury, that is something that actually happens to the brain and that can cause a clinical syndrome, such as a concussion. Other examples would be something like a seizure or a stroke. So those are events that happen in the brain that can cause a clinical syndrome, but they are sort of a different terminology. And then we have what we call chronic diseases. So a chronic disease could be something like CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or Alzheimer's disease. And these describe the changes that are happening in the brain that can cause a clinical syndrome, such as dementia. So Alzheimer's disease causes dementia, and dementia is the group of symptoms that someone is actually experiencing in their life. So hopefully that just sort of clarifies a little bit of the terminology that I'm going to use throughout this talk. So to go a bit further, so concussion is something that everyone sort of asks about, what is a concussion? The definition is that it's an injury to the brain that results in a temporary loss of normal brain function. So it's a clinical syndrome that's caused by a mild traumatic brain injury. So you can sometimes hear these terms sort of interchangeably, but from a sort of scientific perspective, when we're studying it, we're often studying what happens in the brain after a mild traumatic brain injury, and the person may have experienced a concussion as in their day-to-day life, the loss of temporary loss of normal brain function. Head impacts is another term I'm going to use, but this is sort of, as it suggests, any kind of impact to the head. So that can cause the brain to move around inside the skull. A head impact can cause a mild traumatic brain injury. They can be subclinical as well, so they could cause a concussion, but they could also not cause a concussion. So you can have head impacts that move the brain tissue around inside your skull, but don't actually result in any clinical symptoms that you would notice in your day-to-day life. So I guess the important thing here is that while we talk all about concussions, you can also have head impacts, especially in sports, trainings and games. You could sort of have collisions that cause the brain to sort of bump around inside the skull, but might not cause any symptoms. And we know that those head impacts that are potentially not concussive can have long-term effects, especially if there's lots and lots of them that happen over your lifetime. So I'll be referring a lot to head impacts throughout this talk because it means an impact could be causing a concussion or not causing a concussion, and it's really what's happening inside the skull that we're interested in to try and figure out what's going on in the brain. So let's just give you a sort of a sense of the timeline of the research that we're doing. So if you kind of imagine this as the scale of your life, obviously people live a lot longer than 80, but I couldn't fit that on the slide, so we're just going to go up to there for now. Most people will start playing collision sports or contact sports when they're quite young. And if you're like me, you've kind of been playing up until your adult life as well. And really, this is the time over these sort of 10, 20 plus years that we're experiencing lots of these head impacts. So these are the sorts of collisions that will kind of bump your brain around inside your skull that could cause a concussion, or it could have no clinical symptoms associated with it. But all that repetitive head impact can build up. And we know that for the majority of people, they will be absolutely fine. They'll live a perfectly normal, happy, healthy life with no issues. But for some people, there is an increased risk of developing cognitive decline. So that's the symptoms, the changes in your brain function that affect your daily life. And for some people of that group that do develop those changes, that can happen a lot earlier than what we normally see in degenerative brain diseases. Diseases like Alzheimer's disease, we typically see in people over the age of 65. But with people with this repeated head impact exposure, they can develop these diseases a lot younger, and sometimes as early as in their 40s. So cognitive decline can progress into dementia, which is changes in your brain function that affect your daily life. And that dementia can be caused by a range of underlying chronic diseases. So these are diseases that change the brain. So that could be CTE, which I'll talk about tonight, Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, frontotemporal dementia. There's a growing body of scientific literature showing that people who have this repeated head impact exposure have an increased risk of developing these conditions that can cause dementia. Now, when I see the brain, it's usually at the end of the person's life. So they've had this long, amazing, incredible life of all the amazing things that they've done, where they have experienced head impacts. They may have developed a cognitive decline and dementia. They may have one of these underlying diseases that have caused that. And we're trying to understand, over the context of their whole life, what could have caused that disease. So we're going to start off today really kind of focusing on CTE because this is one of these chronic diseases that we know is really specifically linked to head injuries. So by understanding this disease, it can help us get a better sense of how that head impact exposure affects the brain and could increase the risk for all of these other conditions as well. So what do we do in our research? Well, our main question is trying to understand how repeated head impact exposure increases the risk for these degenerative brain diseases. So while CTE is the one that is talked about quite a lot in the media right now, if you sort of follow the stories in the news, you'll probably see CTE mentioned quite a bit. But actually, repeated head impacts can increase the risk for other diseases as well. And we're really interested in understanding why that is and how do we prevent it. And then the main thing that we find when we talk to patients and their families and athletes that are playing at the moment is, how do we diagnose these better? Because so many people say to us, the biggest challenge that we have is just finding out what's going on. If you can imagine someone in their 40s starting to experiencing things like memory loss or changes in their personality, you wouldn't always think that the first thought is a brain disease. You could think it'd be something else. So most people are just trying to get an understanding of what is actually going on in my mind, give me some answers. And so that's why so much of our research is really focused right now on diagnosis. Because without diagnosis, we can't figure out who we should be treating. We can't figure out who is at the most risk, and we can't figure out what is going to work best for those people. So while treatment is really, really important, and that's definitely one of our other focuses, we've just found that without diagnosis, we don't know who to help. So right now, our main goal is to try and find biomarkers. So these are sort of these things that we can measure that tell us something about what's happening in the brain. So it could be something that we can measure in the blood, or something that we can see on an MRI scan that tells us that this person has changes going on in their brain that are more likely to be related to a degenerative brain disease. And that would, make sure that we're giving people the right type of treatments in the future. So the goal of our research right now is to better understand why repeated head impact exposure increases the risk, what's actually happening in the brain, and find these biomarkers that we can use to better detect, who do we help, who actually needs this support. And the goal in the future is really to be able to get a better sense of how people are going well before they develop a degenerative brain disease. So we really want to be preventing these things. So we know that sport is a big part of our life, and sometimes head impacts are unavoidable due to other circumstances. So the goal is to be able to sort of take measurements over someone's lifetime and say, okay, how are you tracking? Is your brain function, is your brain doing really well, or, do you need to stop and rest for a bit? And these biomarkers would allow us to objectively measure what's actually happening in the brain to see how it's going. So that's why one of our really key focuses right now is biomarkers. And to explain a bit more about how that works, I just first want to introduce you to your very incredible brain. This is obviously an animation, but it has a pretty good link to the real thing. And you can see that it's a stunning, complex structure with lots of folds and lots of delicate tissues and blood vessels that, everything is there in exactly the right order so that you can function, as you function and be able to think and feel and move and do all the things that you do. And it really is quite an incredible, very delicate structure that's inside our skull. But it's even more incredible under the microscope. So my team are very lucky that we get to look at brain tissue under the microscope on a daily basis. And this is an example of what we see. So your brain tissue structure is this very delicate little microenvironment of lots of different cells that are all working together and talking to each other in exactly the right way for you to be able to function. And you can imagine that if you have damage to this, very beautiful, delicate structure here, then you'll get changes in your brain function as well. So I'm going to introduce you to some of the key players that we sort of study in this context of brain injury. So the ones that are sort of labeled up in purple here, these are our neurons. So your neurons are really they're the main signaling cells. They're the cells that talk to each other in the brain and allow you to move and to think and to feel. So they're doing all the sort of the heavy electrical signaling and talking for your brain function. But they are supported by this network of cells called astrocytes. And they're called astrocytes because they look like stars. And their job is to support the neurons and keep them healthy and also sort of maintain sort of this protective role in the brain to make sure that the whole environment is kept sort of tidy and looked after. We also have these little cells. I won't talk about them too much tonight, but we do study them quite a lot, called microglia. And their job is to act as an immune cell. So what they do is they sort of scurry around and clean up any debris or damage that can occur in the brain. And then another really important structure are these blood vessels. So they're labeled up in blue here. And blood vessels are really important, obviously, because the blood will flow through them and nutrients from your blood will get into the brain to keep the neurons happy, keep the astrocytes supporting them, and also to clear out waste from your brain. So the blood vessels are really important structures, but your brain is actually really sort of special in the sense that the brain tissue itself doesn't really like to be in contact with blood. The blood is always kept inside the blood vessel, and that's because the blood is full of iron, and iron can stress out the cells in the brain. So we like to keep the blood inside the vessels. It doesn't actually physically touch the brain tissue itself. And to do that, if we sort of took a cut through one of these little cells and went really, really deep into it, what you would see is there's this really complex little structure called the blood-brain barrier. And what that is, this is sort of our blood vessel in the middle here. It's sort of encapsulated by all of these little cells, including the little feet of these astrocytes, that wrap around the blood vessel and tightly regulate what can get in and out of it. And that means that only the nutrients can get in and the waste can get out, and nothing else that's floating around in your blood can enter the brain. So if you had an infection or there was sort of a virus or a little bit of bacteria in there, it's not going to get into your brain. So it's a really important structure. So these are sort of the key components that we study in the brain tissue to get a better understanding of what is changing in disease and what is changing in brain injury. So what actually happens in a brain injury? This is a little sort of video over here that kind of gives you a sense of what's going on in the brain. And you can see here, so it sort of gets the point across that your brain is sort of floating around inside your skull. And if you have an impact to the skull, your brain moves inside of it. And all of those delicate little folds can sort of move around inside, and that can stretch and contract and damage the tissue. So an injury could be a blunt impact to the head. It could be an acceleration or deceleration, like a whiplash injury, or it could even be similar to blast injury, where you actually sort of have a blast wave affecting your head, which can make your brain move. The main things that we know that happen very quickly are things like blood vessel damage to that delicate blood-brain barrier I just mentioned, and the brain cells themselves can actually be sort of torn or damaged. These little tails that conduct the electrical signals can be damaged. But then we know that over time, there is more damage that can happen. So these sort of things here happen in the early stages and sort of hours to days after an injury, and the severity of which will depend on how bad the injury is. And then over time, we see other processes happening. So we have what's called oxidative stress. So if you've heard of antioxidants, that's these are things that try and mop up oxidative stress processes. So we know that the cells can become very stressed, and that can cause them to degenerate. We know that inflammation can occur, and inflammation can be protective, but if it persists for a long time, it can be a problem. And we know that proteins that aren't supposed to clump up can start to clump up and cause neurodegeneration. So these sort of secondary injuries can occur weeks, months, years after an injury. And the severity of these different processes will depend on the severity of the injury. So you can imagine in a mild injury, this could be very, very mild. There might not be too much of this primary and secondary injury happening. But if you repeat it over and over again, you can get an accumulation of this damage. So here's some big questions that we have in the field. How many impacts are too many? I get asked this a lot. Well, what's the safe number? We don't know, and it will be different for every person. It really depends on what we think is cumulative force. So if you have a very high number of very high force impacts, that's going to equate to more damage and more risk of degeneration down the track. But we don't have a magic number as to how many. It'll be different for everybody. Why do some people experience symptoms for longer than others? Again, you're going to get a theme here. We don't really know the answer, and that's really what the research is trying to do, is to understand what is it about the brain tissue that's changing, and why do some people have potentially a different response or sort of a more severe response to maybe a smaller injury than others. We really don't know, and we're working on that in the field right now. And do male and female brains respond differently to injury? This is a huge question, and obviously, as a woman in sport myself, I am really, really interested in this. We just don't have enough research on women and brain injury, is the honest reason. And as someone who studies CTE, which is a degenerative brain disease linked to head injuries, there are only a handful of cases in the world of brain donations from female sports people. So, we're really at a stage, I think, where women's sport is starting to take off, and we want these answers, and we haven't quite got there yet. So a big area of research right now is trying to understand, how is it different in a woman? So I know that's frustrating because everyone has these questions and we don't have good answers, but that's why we need the research. Now, some of the challenges we face in this field, you probably can think of some yourself, but the main problem is that every injury is very variable. So you can imagine that where the person is hit, how they're hit, that can be very different, whether from the side, from the front, twisting motions. The forces can vary, how frequently the impacts happen can vary, and lots of individual factors can also come into play. So brain injury research is really, really difficult because every injury, whether mild or severe, repeated or single injury, is just so, so variable, and that can make it really difficult to get sort of answers that will be relevant to the whole population. The second is that we don't have a very accurate measure right now of cumulative head impact exposure. I've spent a bit of time trying to get an idea of like what could we use to better understand how much force is too much. And we really just don't have good measurements right now of, how much force someone's actually experiencing, say, if they play a contact sport for 10 plus years. But I think that now with instrumented mouth guards that are measuring these forces over time, as that data accumulates, probably over years, that will start to help us get some of these answers. And the other challenge is that there's a very long delay between the head impact exposure, the repeated head impact exposure, and the development of the cognitive decline. So we can't really tell right now just by looking at a field of, say, rugby players, who might develop cognitive decline down the road, or if none of them will. So trying to figure out who we should be studying, who is at the highest risk, is a challenge for research, because we don't know who we should be studying until they develop symptoms, and we want to be trying to prevent those symptoms. So that's sort of leads into what we do at the Brain Bank. So what we do is we are studying brain tissue from donors who have had a significant history of contact sport. So these could be people that have played a lot of contact sport, many, many years, and experienced cognitive decline or a neurodegenerative disease, or they could be people who had no cognitive problems. Because we want to know what is different between the person that had played the sport and did develop a brain disease and someone who played the sport and didn't. Because that's really what is what's interesting to us, because we know that there's age-related factors that will come into it as well, but we want to know what is unique to that head injury exposure. We're part of a global brain banking initiative, which is a group of brain banks all over the world that are pairing together to try and accelerate research on this. So we're collaborating internationally with researchers in the UK, the US, and Australia as well to get a better sense of what's happening. And also it means that we can just really push this research faster because everyone's working together and sharing their findings. So this is a truly incredible resource funded by the Neurological Foundation that has really allowed so much new research to come about. And if you want to understand a brain disease, the best way to do that is to actually study the brain of someone who had that condition. We can try and model things in animals as much as we like, but really, if you want to know what's actually happening, you need to study the real thing. So this is a truly incredible resource. To tell you a little bit more about the Sports Brain Bank side of this, because the Sports Brain Bank is a relatively new initiative of the wider Human Brain Bank. So the Human Brain Bank has been going on. We had our 15-year anniversary, was it? I can't remember what the year was, but we had our anniversary the other last year, and it's been going for a long time and receiving donations from people with Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and Huntington's disease. But really what we've been doing recently is actually receiving the sports donations, and that's sort of the new arm of it. We've had over 40 donations since we launched this initiative, registrations since we launched this initiative in 2019. And that's, people making this very amazing decision to donate their brain to research after they pass away. And it really is the most incredible gift you can make to research is to bequeath your brain, because it really is, helping future generations after your past, which I just always find quite outstanding. We've received 11 cases so far with a history of this repeated head injuries, so mostly contact sports. And to give you a sort of sense of what we're seeing, we mostly are seeing people that have, a neurological condition. And so we've seen within these 11 cases, we've seen CTE, Alzheimer's, frontotemporal dementia, and Parkinson's disease. And if you look at the numbers there, you'll know that they don't add up to 11, and that's because people can actually present with lots of multiple different disease pathologies in their brain after they've passed away. So it's actually possible to see CTE and Alzheimer's disease together in the same brain tissue. And that's why they sort of fall into multiple categories. But what you hopefully get a sense of here is that there's multiple degenerative conditions that we're seeing in this group so far. This is a relatively small number of brains to study, and obviously to get the most impactful data, we need to look at the most brains we can, the more that we can. So for the initial part of our research, we were actually collaborating with the Australian Sports Brain Bank and the Boston CTE Brain Bank to study CTE specifically, because it has this really specific link to head injuries. And so it gives us a really clear window into what the brain injury is doing. I'll give you a quick rundown of what CTE is in case you haven't encountered it before, just sort of to give you a sense of what we're studying. This is a progressive degenerative disease, and it's specifically seen in people who have experienced these head impacts. We don't see it in people that haven't had that head impact exposure. Sorry. We predominantly see this in contact sport athletes, but we can also see CTE in people who have been exposed to blast injuries, people who have been victims of domestic violence, and also in the prison population. So groups of people that have had exposure to repeated head impacts. At the moment, it is a neuropathology diagnosis, so it can only be diagnosed post-mortem. And as I mentioned before, better diagnosis is a huge priority here. And we know that it's related to the number and the force of impacts that a person has experienced. So if someone has experienced a higher number of high force impacts over their lifetime, there's a higher risk of CTE. And this is what it looks like in the brain. So it starts off as this accumulation of a protein called tau deep in the folds of the brain tissue. So that's quite important because it's really accumulating. The changes in the brain are really accumulating deep in these folds and specifically around blood vessels. I'll show you a picture in a second. And as the disease progresses, we start to see more areas affected. So at the start of the disease, it affects areas of the frontal lobe, which are involved a lot in personality and regulation of behaviors. But as the disease progresses, it can affect this area down here called the hippocampus, which is all about learning and memory. So we do see it progressively getting worse over time. And if we zoom up and look at that under the microscope, this is what it looks like, as you see this accumulation of the tau protein around these blood vessels. You have to trust me, these are blood vessels, in a very thin slice of brain tissue. And this is deep at the bottom of one of these folds. So we see this tau protein clustering within neurons, those signaling cells around the blood vessels, very specific pathology. So how does this happen? And this is really one of the questions we want to answer because it's going to give us clues as to how head injuries can impact the brain across all different sort of scenarios. So kind of looking back at our sort of brain as it's moving here, what we know is that these tau tangles, this damage, especially in CTE, is forming in the areas where stress is concentrating during an impact. So parts of the brain that are around blood vessels, the force kind of concentrates. These are sort of like, imagine like isobars on a weather map, where the lines get close together is where the force is concentrating. So you concentrate around the blood vessels, the tissue around these areas, and also at the folds. So these are parts of the brain that are experiencing the most force accumulation during an impact. And those are the parts of the brain where the pathology, the changes in the brain are happening. And we see this in nature. I use this example if you've ever seen me give a talk before, of like a manhole cover in the concrete. And as cars drive over it, the force that's applied is sort of these areas where there's a difference of structure. So you have the rigidity of the manhole cover, which is similar to the blood vessel, and then the concrete around it is where all of that force accumulates. And then a similar example with a horse hoof, because I used to ride horses, so I quite like this example, is if you get a crack in the hoof, or even if you have a crack in your nail, every time the force is applied there, it actually concentrates down into the groove and it will split that further. So this is just sort of an example of really what we think is that the physics of the head impact and the structure of the human brain with all of those folds is what is defining the changes that we see. And so what we think is happening is that these impacts, the brain is moving and stretching and all that force is accumulating in the folds, and that is damaging that blood-brain barrier I mentioned at the start, which can lead to inflammation that doesn't necessarily go away, especially if the impacts are happening over and over and over again. The brain just isn't getting a chance to recover. So that was a piece of work that we recently just published showing, well, what does this look like in the brain? Is this actually happening? Is there a concentration of inflammation in the brain? So this is work that was done by my PhD student, Chelsea. She's in the third year of her PhD now, and she worked on tissue provided by the Australia Sports Brain Bank. And essentially what she did is she looked at Alzheimer's disease cases from people who didn't have a history of sport, normal cases, and all of the kind of hot colors here, the yellow, the greens, these are this is evidence of inflammation in the brain. And the blue protein is actually this protein that's involved in water, moving water across the blood-brain barrier. So in a normal, neurologically normal person, there's lots of this blue protein around because, there's lots of water being moved in and out of the blood vessels, and that's really normal and good. In Alzheimer's disease, we see inflammation everywhere. And you can see that that blue protein is quite patchy and splotchy. So there's been sort of this change and reduction of how the cells are helping get the water across and lots of inflammation happening. But what we wanted to do is compare this to what we see in CTE, because what we think is happening is that inflammation is concentrating around the blood vessels. And that is exactly what Chelsea saw. So this little vessel here you can see in the middle, this is actually speckled with the tau protein. I don't know if you've got really good eyes, you might be able to see it in purple. But there's sort of this cluster of this green protein here, which is involved in oxidative stress or stressing out the brain cells. And it's all clustered around this blood vessel here. And this is a different case, and there's a couple more examples down the bottom. So what Chelsea was able to show is that there is actually this sort of clustering of inflammation around these specific blood vessels deep in the folds of the brain in CTE. And we think that that's going to be a really important clue as to how this disease is developing and potentially how other diseases could develop in people with head injury exposure. And then more recently, he's now a master's student, Stanley. He was actually funded by a Neurological Foundation summer research scholarship to do some work looking at, well, what about those cases I mentioned that we see CTE and Alzheimer's disease together in the brain? Do we still see that signature of inflammation deep in the folds of the brain around those blood vessels? And just to confuse you, he's changed the colors. So the purple is actually the color for the protein involved in oxidative stress. But what he showed is actually even in the presence of Alzheimer's disease pathology, you still see this clustering of oxidative stress markers around these blood vessels in people with head impact exposure. So we think that this is potentially a really promising biomarker that we could maybe see with an MRI or measure in blood to get a better sense of what's actually happening in the brain. Stanley's actually going on to look at this further in his master's project this year, so then some really exciting results coming, which hopefully I can share at a later date. Now, just sort of before I finish up, I just want to sort of highlight what we kind of how we make sense of all of this. So what we think is happening is it's those astrocytes, those supporting cells that are actually secreting all these inflammatory markers, inflammatory proteins that are driving that oxidative stress, which is killing the neurons. That's what we think is happening. But remember, we're studying the brains of people at the end of their life, after they've passed away, and lived an crazy, amazing life, all the things that they've done. So what we need to do is actually go back and look more at the start of the process after the head injuries to see what's actually happening there. Is that actually matching? Do we see this inflammation and oxidative stress happening early in the process that's carrying on? But you can't really do that in people because no one really wants to submit their brain for research before they've passed away. So how do we do that? Well, I have another very amazing, you can see the trend here, all my very incredible students. Danica, who again is actually funded by a Neurological Foundation PhD scholarship to study this process of inflammation and how it affects the neurons. And what she's doing is actually growing brain cells in a dish and then sort of applying these inflammation markers to them to see how they respond, to see if we can try and simulate this in a dish to then potentially test new treatments on it down the line. And we have another really exciting study that I'm hopefully going to get going this year is the plan. We were actually going to start looking at these rams. So if anyone knows all about sheep, you might know that rams like to headbutt each other. And so they are actually a really sort of natural model of repeated head injury. And we've been talking to farmers and to our university farm to acquire the brains of rams who have passed away naturally after a bit of a lifetime of headbutting. And what you can see from their brain, which is quite amazing, is that it has a similar sort of folded structure to a human brain. So it's quite good for studying a condition where we see changes deep in the folds because they actually have that fold and they undergo the same sort of headbutting impact exposure that potentially humans in sport might. So we're going to have a look at these rams and with a collaboration with Miriam Scatting, who is working with also on a Neurological Foundation project grant. We're trying to develop fancy new MRI scans with these sheep to see whether or not we can actually see those changes visually on an MRI scan. So we've acquired some of these MRI scans of the sheep brain, and Miriam has this really amazing technology with the MRI where she can sort of pick up these hot spots of inflammation. And she's been doing this work with multiple sclerosis, where you have these white matter lesions inside the brain, which are quite inflamed. And usually they use this sequence called FLAIR imaging to see them. You can kind of see them as these white spots. And she has this new sequence on the MRI where she can see them really, really clearly. And we're going to adapt that to try and see them in the sheep, in the rams, in the grey matter where the pathology is developing. So this is sort of how do we take this closer to actually be useful to humans and to understand what's happening earlier in the brain injury stage before it develops into degeneration. So that's sort of what's coming. Now, I need to finish up because I keep talking. I get all excited about this. So I want to sort of finish up with a sort of what does this mean for you listening to this talk right now? Like the science is all very interesting, hopefully, you think. but what does this actually mean for you? So, I think the key here is that head injuries can be a risk factor for a degenerative brain disease. So, throughout our life, we can be exposed to lots of different risk factors, and we can do, lots of things to try and reduce those risk factors. And if we think of sort of the staircase of risk over time, we might be born with a certain genetic predisposition towards a neurodegenerative condition. We might not never even know about it, but there are some genetic risk factors that we know can predispose people to a higher risk of degenerative brain disease. And repeated head impact exposure is potentially another risk factor that can kind of, take us another step closer to that. But then there are all these other things in our life that we know are modifiable risk factors. Modifiable meaning that we can do something about them to reduce our risk of developing degenerative brain diseases. So these sorts of things here, excessive alcohol consumption, social isolation, physical inactivity, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, these are all conditions that have been linked to an increased risk of degenerative brain diseases. So as an athlete myself, people always say, well, how do you sort of take this research? And I think my mindset is that I don't know about my genetic risk factor for dementia. I know I have probably given myself this head impact exposure one, but I can avoid all these other things. I can eat well, I can sleep well, I can avoid alcohol, I can stay physically active and look after myself and eat, good healthy food and stay, socially connected. And those sorts of things will make sure that I don't take too many more steps up this risk factor. So I guess really what I would like to say is, to look after your brain because there's lots of things that we can do in our lives to help maintain our brain function as we age. And then just lastly, I do get lots of questions around cognitive impairment and people who have been athletes or have experienced this kind of head trauma. The main point I would make is after talking to lots of clinicians, their advice is to please see your GP if you think you have any, if you think you have you're experiencing these sort of symptoms, and ask for a referral to a neurologist. I know the wait times can be long, but that's the best way to get answers and that are specific to you. Our general mantra is what's good for your heart is good for your brain. So all those things I just mentioned in terms of exercising and eating well and prioritizing sleep, these are things that will help you look after your brain function as you age. And if you're really interested in this research or learning more about brain donation, you can visit our website at brainbank.ac.nz or email the Brain Bank to get more information about the process. It really is just the most incredible gift to research. So, we think our brain donor families are just the most incredible people. And people are always asking, how do I get involved in research and how can I be part of it? We are hoping to launch studies looking at, brain blood samples and MRI scans in living people in the future, but we're not quite there yet. So if you are interested, you can have a look at the CBR Centre for Brain Research volunteer register, and we'll contact people on there when we're ready to do these studies. So just finally, I've tried to kind of acknowledge people throughout the slides as we got to them, but a massive thank you to the Neurological Foundation Human Brain Bank directors, Morris and Richard, who without their expertise, this wouldn't be possible. My very amazing team, I've shown you research from Chelsea, Danica, and Stanley tonight. Miriam, who's going to be a huge part of our next steps, all of our incredible collaborators, and of course our funders, because as you can see, the Neurological Foundation have been huge supporters of this work, and we could not do this research without funding, because without conducting this kind of research, we're not going to get the answers that we need to develop better diagnostic tools and better treatments in the future. So I'll stop talking. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Helen. It's amazing. I know how much research you're doing, and for you to dial it down into something that's really simple and easy to understand has been amazing. So thank you very much for that. And let's move on to some questions. I should tell you first that we celebrated the 30th anniversary last year.
30th, not the 15th, sorry.
And it was the 15th anniversary of the Centre for Brain Research. So that's where the 15 years came from.
That's where the 15 years came from. 30 years of brain banking, incredible.
Yeah, and that was a big factor in starting the Centre for Brain Research as well. So those two anniversaries were really exciting to be a part of last year. So the first question, how common is it for people to develop epilepsy as a result of a traumatic brain injury?
Yeah, this is I can't give you stats specifically because it really depends on the severity. I think from my understanding of the research, the more severe the injury, there is the higher chances of these sorts of things like seizures and epilepsy developing. And it really kind of comes down to the disruption of those brain cells talking to each other that can cause that sort of disconnect in the seizure activity. So it's hard to give a specific statistic because it's probably a bit more related to more the severe brain injuries. But yes, it can be a sort of a longer term effect from that sort of secondary damage I mentioned.
And is the research feeding into models of care and support for people with TBI?
Yeah, we do actually really interact a lot with various different groups with sort of Dementia New Zealand, Alzheimer's New Zealand, Headway, Auckland Brain Injury. So there's lots of groups around, clinical groups, support groups that are interested obviously in this research and what we're finding and the new tools that we're developing. And we obviously want to get information from them around, what actually matters to patients. What sort of questions do people want us to be researching? So we collaborate really closely with all of these groups all around the country.
Oh, that's awesome to hear. I know you talked about the different things you can do for your brain health that are similar for your heart health, but what about screen time? Does that affect recovery from concussion, especially for young people?
Yeah, this is a really a sort of developing area of research because obviously screen time is a big sort of deal now in our very digital age. And it's also so important with, people working, school, digital devices and screen time is just a huge part of our life now. So there's more and more research going on about this. The main thing we find with especially concussion recovery is that we sort of want to treat the brain a bit more like a muscle. So it's about doing a little bit to see, where is your threshold for symptoms. And once you start, okay, I'm getting a headache again, or I'm getting dizziness, okay, you need to dial back. So it's all about sort of figuring out where you're at. And I think, screen time can be quite hard on the eyes and it can be, cognitively very stimulating. So those things can, if you're recovering, small amounts at the start as you're recovering is probably the way to go, not too much. And then as you start to recover, you might find that you can kind of go a little bit longer before you start to feel, sensitive again. So it's really hard to say. It's a very individual specific thing. And I would say definitely, go with the advice of your concussion specialist or your brain injury specialist if you're seeing someone. But I would say limiting it at the start and just really gently managing return to screen time.
The next question, I love this one. How does research in New Zealand compare to research in other countries?
Oh, that's such a good question. So I worked in America. I worked in the National Institutes of Health, which is one of the most sort of premier research institutes in the world with all of the funding you could possibly dream of. And I think what's really, really interesting is when I went over there and I brought over some of the brain tissue from our human brain bank. The researchers in America were astounded at the quality of the results that we got from the human brain tissue here. So, the images I showed you, sometimes that's not so easy to obtain from brain tissue. And yeah, the feedback we've had is that our tissue and our research is absolutely up there with the best institutions in the world. And we even have researchers specifically from America requesting our New Zealand human brain bank tissue because it's so good. And I think it's because we're a brain bank that is, run by researchers for researchers. And rather than sort of run by like a hospital pathology department for pathology purposes. So yeah, it's really heartwarming, and I think that's one of the main reasons I wanted to come back to New Zealand is because I can see that we are doing world-class research in New Zealand with all the benefits of being in a relatively small country where we're really well connected with each other, with the community groups, with the clinicians, and with the families of our brain donors. So yeah, in short, we're absolutely up there with the best institutions in the world.
So obviously in terms of funding, it's really difficult to match what's going on in the US and that sort of thing. But what kind of impact could increased support have for researchers in New Zealand in achieving breakthrough in CTE and TBI research?
Yeah, I think there's a few different areas here. I mean, obviously, the work we do in the lab is expensive in its own right. There is costs involved in doing these experiments that need to be done to get the answers, but also, in the people and investing in people and growing our expertise in New Zealand and retaining that expertise in New Zealand. There's lots of opportunities around the world, but people want, our researchers want to be here in New Zealand, and we have so many questions that I think we are so uniquely positioned to answer here because of all of those sort of that interconnectedness of our neuroscience ecosystem. So I think what research funding is not only helping us actually do the work in the lab, but it's helping us develop the workforce to do that world-class research here. So, without that funding, I just don't think we would make the progress as quickly as we have been.
So what does that collaboration look like between researchers and healthcare providers in New Zealand? And is that different to what you see overseas?
Yeah, I think my understanding from the international sector, is that it can be, huge institutions. It can be quite difficult to talk in between, and the systems don't always help, enable that. But in New Zealand, we're positioned at the University of Auckland, directly across the road from the clinicians. We have clinicians as part of our research staff, so we have neurologists. Neuropsychologists as part of our research teams, and they're helping us directly sort of understand, well, what are the challenges that they're seeing in the clinic? What is difficult to diagnose? What is difficult to treat? What are the trends and how people are presenting that we might be able to better understand? And then how can we get that data from our brain donors? What was their medical history like, and that kind of thing. And so those connections are really important for informing research. And our community connections are hugely important for figuring out what is the most important question. Because when I started this, everyone was like treatment, treatment, treatment. But actually, the main thing that people are asking me is help me get a diagnosis so I can get support, so I can get the financial support, so I can be eligible for a certain trial or a treatment or something like that. So, actually finding out what's important to people, that's what the connections are all about.
So there's one question here about multiple concussions in children and whether that could lead to long-term changes in behavior or personality. Is that sort of related to the area of the injury, like you mentioned in your talk?
It can be. We actually don't see any specific part of the brain that is most affected. I think, the frontal lobe is where most of the time things start, which is that sort of front part of the brain. Um, but there's not enough research on what's happening in the developing brain. And as children are developing, your brain is developing new connections and everything all the time. So it's a tricky thing to answer, but we know that repeated concussions or repeated head impacts or over time can sort of lower your threshold, which means it could take a less severe impact next time to cause the same symptoms. So you sort of develop this vulnerability to having more changes over time. And that's, I think, if we could delay those sorts of injuries until people were older, you'd have less lifetime exposure, which is a huge piece. And you'd also have, potentially less sensitivity to these impacts as you're aging.
Yeah, I guess it's hard to know, particularly if they're becoming teenagers. Is it related to head knocks in sport, or is it just what's happening as they're developing? So some more research in that field, I think, would be really helpful.
Yeah, and there's some really great research happening in Marta. I'd point to the Gisborne Research Group are doing some really amazing work down there on rugby players and concussion and head injuries. So I'd advise people to check out their work as well.
Yeah. So you mentioned that people can sign up for the CBR volunteer registry. Does that include someone who's had multiple things like a stroke or seizures or a car accident? Would you still take someone who's maybe older and had multiple head impacts?
It will really depend on the study. So our primary focus at the moment is sort of that repeated head impact exposure. So exposure to multiple sort of contact sports or maybe had multiple concussions or over a long period of time. That's our first focus. But there will potentially be future studies where we might look a bit more specifically at more single severe injuries like car accident or equestrian or things like that, which can be less repetitive and more single severe. But the volunteer register is really sort of for people who are interested in being part of research. When a study does come up or is funded or it becomes available, that's sort of the first place we go to advertise for people who might want to be part of it. So when that study comes up, it will depend on what are the inclusion and exclusion criteria.
So I think for this next question, you'll probably say that we're needing research in that area, but what's the difference between how the brain reacts to a major head injury versus several minor ones in terms of recovery potential?
Yeah, this actually is one of the things we really are quite interested in. We know that with severe impacts, so those features I talked about at the start with the primary injury and the secondary injury, they can occur in much more severity. So you can have much more damaging blood vessel issues, or you could have, sorry, increased neuronal damage. So, those that damage can be a lot stronger and be take a lot longer to recover. We think what's happening with the repeated head injury is that it's sort of the difference between sort of slamming a rock at a window and just gently tapping it for a long time. Is that it takes a lot longer, but that damage can still accumulate to the same level. So, in short, we need a lot more research to understand the difference between a single injury and many repeated mild ones. But in terms of the risk for neurodegeneration, we know that that risk is there in both situations. So a sort of a single severe injury or repeated mild, both increase the risk for degenerative diseases. Yeah.
So you mentioned different things like diabetes and cardiovascular disease. What about conditions like arthritis, like really inflammatory conditions like that? Can that affect how you recover from a brain injury if you've got other things going on in your body?
That's a really good question, and one I'm becoming more and more interested in as our research starts to sort of head more in this inflammation direction. Is, what are, potentially factors that in people's lives that could alter that inflammation pattern in their brain. So, again, it's sort of repeated as my answer. So we don't know. We don't actually have the research on, you need groups of people that have that kind of immune changes, arthritis or autoimmune conditions potentially, and people who don't, in order to actually make those comparisons. And so until we do that kind of study, we won't really know for sure. But I think it's an area that I'm getting more and more interested in to see, could that be a factor that could underline some of the vulnerability to these conditions? Yeah.
So we're now on 8 o'clock, and I'm just wondering if you want to spend a few more minutes answering some questions.
Yeah, sure, I can do.
If you've got the time to do that, because there's so many coming through, but I think
no problem.
So can you just let people know again how they could donate their brain to the brain bank?
Yeah, I'll just flick back to the slide. So the brain donation process, if you want to learn more about it, this website, brainbank.ac.nz, is the best place to go to get lots of information. There's also a registration form there. If you're interested, you can sign up and you'll get information. You can also email this email address to request information as well. I think the main thing about the brain donation is, this is a process that's very different to body donation or organ donation. So it's something that we need the brain as soon as possible after a person passes away in order to be the best use for research. And so it's a different type of process. And we, obviously it's an incredible thing to do, but there are sometimes situations where we can't accept every brain. We have lots of active studies going in lots of different areas, but there'll be sort of certain, I guess, like eligibility criteria as to, sometimes for resourcing and storage and things like that, we can't accept every single brain that is offered. But the main thing is to contact the brain bank to get more information. It needs to be sort of initiated by the family itself, and then you can answer all your questions. The team there are really, really amazing at telling you what it's all about.
Do you know of a way that people could find out which neurologists specialise in treating head injuries?
Oh, the I'm trying to think of the website. Is it the Healthline or there's a
Health NZ?
yes, you can generally search for neurologists. I really do think that most GPs are pretty good at referring to the sort of the right places. And it's different in every part of the country. So I know we have a really national audience tonight, so I can't really give you specifics because it will depend on where you are in the country. But yeah, there are definitely specialists who have more focus on concussion and clinics that are more sort of concussion specialists. But in terms of neurodegeneration, I would say see any neurologist should be able to help you out.
Oh, thanks for that. Have you come across any specific foods that can help the brain recover from a concussion?
Again, this can be a really individual thing. People can have lots of different preferences or sensitivities to different foods. But the main thing is just, healthy unprocessed food. So, fruit and vegetable. It's all the things that you always hear, right? Healthy eating, yeah, fruits and vegetables and just all of the things that we generally say, are good for your heart, are good for your brain. It really isn't actually that complicated. When you look at the big population studies, and rather than specifying certain types of foods, it's really about the the biggest protection comes from just overall healthy diet as opposed to any one specific yeah, food or supplement. So yeah, I can't really specify anything, one thing in particular, but just overall healthy eating is the best way to go.
So would you say like the brain needs a wide range of vitamins and minerals and amino acids to do everything it needs to do?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
So it's a
Nice
good food.
broad range of all of the different sort of vitamins and yeah, amino acids and everything. That's what we want for a healthy brain.
So do we see secondary symptoms for those who have very long-term effects from a mild concussion?
Sometimes these secondary effects, they're not something that we can always see or measure. So in a mild TBI, mild traumatic brain injury or concussion, some of those changes I mentioned, they could be happening in their brain, but it's happening at such low levels you can't see it on an MRI, you can't measure it in a blood test. And so it can be quite difficult to know, what is actually causing those persistent symptoms if people are still experiencing things. And we really don't know why it is that some people experience, can have a similar severity of injury, and some people can have symptoms for 3 weeks and others can have symptoms for 3 months. We just don't really know yet why is the brain responding differently. And it could be differences in recovery, it could be differences in inflammation, but and I think until we start to develop some of these diagnostic tools where we can actually see the changes on the MRI, we can actually measure them in the blood, we're not going to be able to get those answers. And again, that's why we keep coming back to biomarkers and diagnostics, because that's what's going to allow us to start to answer those sorts of questions.
So I'm just going to finish up with one question now, because I know we could be here all night.
Yeah,
It would be
there's always lots.
fascinating, but I'm sure you don't want to be here all night. But this one's quite interesting. Is tinnitus something that people can experience after a head injury?
Oh, that is a very interesting question. There's potentially reasons why I could see that. When I think there's still a lot of research happening around tinnitus and the potential causes, but when we're talking about brain cells being damaged, connections between different brain regions being affected, potentially if there is some change in the certain networks that are processing sound, I could see how that might lead to tinnitus. Now that's more of a sort of a me theorizing than having any hard data behind that, but I can definitely understand how that could potentially happen. Uh, and a sort of an interesting note that leads me to is that hearing loss was actually also noted as a modifiable risk factor for dementia in the latest epidemiology, big population studies. So, wearing hearing aids if you do have hearing loss can actually, uh, you know, help with that potential hearing loss modifiable risk factor. Yeah. So, So yeah, I haven't really answered your question, but I can understand that it would potentially be related. I could potentially see a scientific link for how that would happen, but I don't know any specific data on it.
Well, thank you so much for your time tonight, Helen, and just again for preparing such an amazing talk where you've taken some very complex research, because I know what you do behind the scenes, and putting it in a way that people can just really understand what concussion and CTE and the different conditions are, and also what you're aiming to do and what you're aiming to find out in your research. And it's a lot of work with a growing group of people, which is really exciting to see. And it's also just exciting to be at the forefront of this new area of research and this new condition, and something we hopefully get to see in our lifetime is discovering what it is and how to diagnose it and treat it would be something really awesome to witness. So best of luck with all of your research. And I want to just thank all of our listeners tonight for joining us and all the interesting questions. And my apologies that we couldn't get to all of them, but just wish you all a really good evening and hope that you can join us next time for our next webinar.